thank you to the organizers for organizing the workshop and for inviting me. And I really look forward to seeing what this center produces in the near future. It's really great to see this interaction of technology ethics and environmental ethics in an institutional context. So my presentation will be about design toolkits, and specifically the potential of design toolkits to reorient design practice towards the goals of social justice and environmental sustainability. In the production of technologies, I'm primarily thinking about AI systems, but this applies to all kinds of design. Design toolkits have emerged in recent years as a primary means of translating the theory of AI ethics into design and development practice. So many organizations, research teams, institutions release their own design toolkits that are supposed to help translate the theory that the given team is producing into practice. Currently, the OECD catalog of toolkits and metrics for trustworthy AI includes around 500 such toolkits. This number is from May, and they include new toolkits every month, so I'm sure that it's actually more. There are all kinds of toolkits. If you ask me what is a design toolkit, there isn't a good answer to this question, precisely because there is a massive variety. And they try to do different things. Some of them are specifically targeting technical people, so data scientists, for example, helping them decide whether a given data set is good enough to use it in the production of a given model. Some are procedural. That means that they might help a given team determine whether, for example, the team is diverse enough. And some might be more strictly educational, introducing the design team to concepts such as trustworthiness or fairness or justice. But this is really to say that there are many of these toolkits. And of course, this catalog doesn't include all of them. In fact, there are so many toolkits that toolkit scoping has become a subgenre of its own in AI ethics scholarship. So these are just some examples, but there are more of these toolkit scoping papers. And what I will share with you to start with is a sort of a review of reviews, so a form of meta critique of these reviews to help identify some common trends in these critiques. So, by the way, if some of these might sound familiar to you, if you're familiar with this work, that's precisely the point, that some of these points get repeated again and again and again in various scoping papers, and yet nothing seems to change. So this meta critique of design toolkits that I will be sharing with you now points to several consistent categories of shortcomings in the design of the toolkits themselves, and these relate to several different things. The first that these meta reviews, the meta review points to, is foundational deficiencies. This is to say that the toolkits that are not good enough because this is reflective of the omissions in the list of values and principles that they are meant to help translate into practice. I will say a bit more about that in a second. The second problem with toolkits as a medium for translating theory into practice is that they embody a reductionist techno-solutionist conception of ethics. And I will also say a bit more about that in a second. And the third one that I think is actually the most important one in a way is that these toolkits identify some ideas such as justice as an important idea to think about in the design of technologies, but they don't really guide the designers through what this means in practice. So there's this problem of co-optation of these ideas, divorced from their political meaning. So I will say about a bit more about that in a second as well. So let's start with these foundational deficiencies. So the meta review points to the fact that actually most toolkits do identify values such as accountability, privacy, trustworthiness, or fairness as important ones to think about, but some values are quite simply missing. The value of solidarity, this can be expressed in different ways, pointing to the question of social justice, is completely omitted by most toolkits. So the idea of human co-flourishing is an important one to guide the development of new technologies. And most importantly for us today, the question of environmental sustainability is almost entirely omitted from these various toolkits or tools. And secondly, these lists of values that are then meant to be translated into practice are not reflective of, they are reflective of values of only, so actually the previous presentation was a very good example of that problem, that it's the European values in this case. And this is very true for the toolkits as well. So they don't really reflect the diversity of opinions and values in different parts of the world. And so the recommendation that actually most of these toolkit scoping papers agree on is that the creators of toolkits should be encouraged to consider the ethics of care, feminist ethics, decolonial theory, and indigenous epistemologies, or relational philosophies in general when designing new toolkits. So let's just remember this recommendation. It appears again and again in several of these papers. The second question, the reductionist techno-solutionist conception of ethics behind most toolkits. Well, this points to the fact that ethics is considered as a matter of compliance with already existing standards and regulations on the part of developers, designers, and data scientists. So ethical reasoning is framed as directly translatable into immediate technological and procedural fixes, rather than a questioning of the reasoning behind technological development and also the harms that the development might lead to that are not immediately visible. So this is to say also that the justifiability of starting a given project, or this question of which systems are worthy of maintenance. So scholars such as Amy van Weinsberg point to this precisely, this question is like, which systems are worthy of maintenance? This is not considered by any toolkit. So questioning whether starting a project in the first place is reasonable and ethical is not really, there is no space for this kind of questioning. And this obviously relates to the fact that the business decision-making that always determines design decision-making is also not given any thought. And as I mentioned, these indirect social and environmental costs that are less visible or less immediately visible are also, there's no guidance for design teams or business teams to even consider them. So again, the recommendation that many papers converge on is abandon box-ticking mentality, provide guidance on how to deal with non-technical aspects of tech development, and pay attention to business decision-making. Also question business decision-making as part of this process. And finally, this third category of shortcomings that most toolkits that are available right now embody is that the fact that they co-opt some terms derived from critical studies of design and technology, but they are not really, they don't really embody a commitment to actual change. So, for example, they gesture towards the needs of for inclusion of diverse stakeholders. But when you actually look at what they mean by stakeholders, they most often point to external experts. So, for example, lawyers, rather than marginalized groups that are not accounted for in the decision making in the first place. So one toolkit scoping paper refers to voiceless stakeholders. There is a big problem with this term, but the reason why I thought I would mention this one here specifically is that it puts together both the environment and marginalized groups as this bigger category of voiceless stakeholders that are ignored by the toolkit producers. And finally, the toolkits fail to account for and help navigate through the difficulties of facilitating power-sensitive conversations between those who are already present at the design table and those whose voices have been excluded or ignored in the past. So, yes, you can say we should, let's say you're working in Australia and the principle would be try to include or talk to indigenous populations there, but how do you do this in an ethical and power sensitive way is not really given any attention. This is one way of saying that toolkits might encourage participation washing. So they gesture towards ideas. They might even help you set up a meeting with various stakeholders, but without this guidance on how to do it in a power-sensitive way, it might be futile. So again, the recommendation is that toolkits should allow for genuine power-sensitive engagement with these voiceless stakeholders, and embody the idea of participation as justice, a genuine attempt to actively include, not extract, insights from minoritized stakeholder groups. Okay, so now the interesting thing about these toolkit scoping papers is that they seem to suggest that we don't have these other types of toolkits that are informed by relational epistemologies, indigenous epistemologies, or feminist ethics, and the truth is that there are alternative toolkits out there, and I will show you a few of those alternative toolkits, and in a way to show you how these alternative toolkits might respond to some of the critiques that I have just mentioned, and then it will be also a way of thinking about whether the challenges of reorienting design practice towards the goals of social justice and environmental sustainability, whether this challenge is actually kitifiable at all. In a way, it isn't, but toolkits might be helpful, as we will see. So first, what do I mean by more than human design? As an alternative design framework. So at its core, more than human design is a response to the human-centric paradigm in design as the dominant one that emerged in the 80s, maybe even a bit earlier. The human-centered design prioritizes, or is supposed to prioritize, the needs of users, ensure that technologies are user-friendly and that help the human users achieve their goals. But implied in this human-centric paradigm is the idea of universalism, so a very concrete idea of that human user that the technology or a given product is designed for. So there hasn't been enough discussion in the human-centric design community about like who it is that we are actually designing for. Are we excluding certain groups of people by imagining? Even if there is a variety of potential users that we are imagining, are we excluding others? And what kind of consequences these choices have? So more than human design is, on the one hand, a critique of this implied universalism of human-centered design. And on the other hand, and most importantly for us today, it is also a critique of the implied anthropocentrism of human-centered design. So can we think of non-human animals in design? And if so, what would that mean? So this bigger framework, more than human design, draws on these various theoretical positions drawn from intersectional feminist critique, post-human theory, post-development studies, indigenous epistemologies, among others. There are various terms that we could use for this kind of design. More than human is the most common one, or more than human-centered, but you could argue for nature-centric design, although then we encounter some of the issues that we discussed after Vincent's presentation. Allocentric is the term that I usually use in my work. So that's from an article that I wrote for Eon a few years ago. Allocentric is the opposite of egocentric, recognizes the value of species by seeing them as nodes in a wider network of interdependencies, a system in which diverse agents design the world together and experience it side by side. The conceptual decentering of the human in design rejects an environmentalism in which technology is solely about stopping human decline, when design is interested in sustainability only as a way of maintaining the anthropocentric status quo of keeping humans at the top of the pile. It fails to combat the logic at the core of the current crisis. And okay, I only have 5 minutes. So, and this is the most interesting part of the presentation, where I show you the alternative kinds of tools or toolkits. So I'll try to be brief. The first one is a guideline on design for carbon-aware digital experiences by Louis. And this is an example of a tool that is meant to help designers design in a way that encourages the users to attune to non-human rhythms. So it's not about awareness only, but it's also about helping us live in a way that is more in line with other species and the environment as a whole. So this first type of toolkit is about transforming the user's behavior specifically. And as an example of what this kind of designing could lead to, this is a project that Louis points to as an example of what kind of results you might achieve if you follow this kind of tool. So this is a nature-controlled internet. So the idea that your connection is better or worse depending on whether natural energy resources are available in your area. So, for example, if it's a very windy day, your internet will be faster. If it's a day without wind or without sun, it might slow down. So again, the idea that designers can help users, humans, attune to non-human rhythms. The second type of toolkit that you can find is a toolkit that helps human designers think of non-human animals and perhaps the environment as an impossible user, to consider these other non-human animals as users, because they are users. They're not always designed. The objects are not necessarily designed for the non-human animals, and I think we will hear more about that in Leonie's talk, right? So we'll see. But and the interesting thing about this specific toolkit is that visually and visually it really mimics the style of a very popular design toolkit designed by Microsoft. And this is the inclusive design toolkit that is very common among designers. This is a toolkit that helps designers think about different types of users that might normally be excluded from the design process, from the design ideation process. So, for example, people living with various forms of disabilities. So, yes, the interspecies design toolkit, in a way, is gesturing towards that toolkit that is very popular, but the aim here is to question the idea of the user even more. And finally, how much time do I have? 2 minutes. Okay, good. So the final example that I would like to give is from Neri Oxman's nature-centric practice. So you might have heard of her work because she had a massive exhibition at MoMA a few years ago. One of the most famous pieces that she and her team exhibit is the Silk Pavilion. The Silk Pavilion was created with living silkworms. So Neri Oxman and her team essentially observed living silkworms' patterns of movement, and then thanks to a machine learning algorithm, they were able to extract. So, I mean, again, in a way, a form of biomimicry in design. But what is particularly interesting for me in this example is that so basically, thanks to that pattern detection, they were then able to steer biological growth using light and humidity. They were actually able to direct the way the silkworms were building this structure that you can see here. So the element that I find most interesting here is that this tool and framework is not only questioning the idea of human behavior, not only the idea of the human user, perhaps extending to include more other non-human animals, but in this case, it's also about questioning who gets to make the world, and perhaps questioning the idea of the maker and thinking about what it might mean for humans to co-design the world with other entities. Artificial intelligence, but also actual non-human animals. So I would have more to say about various types of toolkits that are out there. There are many, many more. I focus here on more than human design toolkits, but there are many similar ones that focus on the idea of intersectionality. So very briefly, because I have to wrap up, what do they have in common, these alternative toolkits? And I think the most important thing to take away from this review is that they address the question of decentering the human in design as an explicitly ethico-political issue. So this is to say that the idea of ethics behind them is not divorced from concrete political questions, including the question of social justice as inherently tied to the idea of environmental sustainability. So they share less with tools like this one, the sustainability checklist by IBM, and share more with political movement building toolkits such as this one, for example, for intersectional movement building, created by the Young Friends of the Earth Europe group. And I mean, I was gonna talk about some of these examples, but I think I'll skip that. And finally, I will just say that I'm working on I'm working on my own tools, ideation tools, and we are testing with my bigger team, some of them with actual design teams working in industry. So this, for example, is an ideation exercise trying to encourage designers to think about the environment as an unimaginable user persona. Of course, it's impossible, but that's exactly the point. It's the idea that these exercises should not be about the making convenient, turning the idea of ethics into something convenient. And this is another one, but I think I'll stop here and wrap up, and thank you so much.
Thank you very much for your talk. I think that everybody will agree with your criticism regarding toolkits. And it's also good to have this overview. At the same time, I was wondering, are you not making a sort of straw man of the current debates in ethics of technology by talking about these toolkits, while I guess that almost every ethicist will agree with you? And there is, for instance, in the European community, but also in the Netherlands and in the UK, a strong development which is called responsible research and innovation, as an sort of theoretical, social, scientific, and philosopher-driven way to take social and ethical issues into account. And I was wondering whether you are aware of that debate, and whether that maybe can also support some of your claims, but also help you to evaluate the alternatives. And I just want to concentrate on the one that you mentioned by Neri Oxman, because indeed she is using a sort of combination between 3D printing and silkworms. And we were considering this case in a discussion about the symbiocene, to what extent life and non-life can work together. But we came to the conclusion that, in fact, this silkworm is exploited not for themselves, but just for fun design in this case. So is that then really a responsible innovation, so to speak, or not? And so that brings me to the question, what are the criteria for you to distinguish between the toolkit tick box exercises and the alternatives? Because I'm also interested in these alternatives, so maybe we can find each other there.
Thank you so much. The most important question really is the one about whether the silkworms were actually exploited. And you could argue that they were. That's definitely a fair critique. And an even more important point of critique of Oxman's work is the funding that helps her do this kind of work and where she's situated systemically. So I usually refer to this project more as an illustration that is fun, as you say, because it very quickly allows most people that are not necessarily thinking about what this more than human thinking might mean for practicing designers. It just gives you a very quick illustration of what this might mean. But this is not given as an example of something that is ideal or that should be reproduced. And in a way, this is precisely my problem with looking for patterns that should be reproduced, that there is always this worry that it might be sort of leading us in the way of universalizing certain solutions and ways of thinking about doing this kind of work, which is actually the opposite of what more than human design thinking is encourages to do. So I don't think it's a concrete response to your point.
And then the question is, okay, so we agree, that there's no universal solution. But then the question is, what type of criteria do we use to distinguish between good directions or better directions or then we need to take the situation, the context into account. And for instance, I have to admit that I'm also a little bit a fan of responsible innovation. There, for instance, anticipation of future impact, reflection on your own motives, inclusion of a broad variety of stakeholders, not only lawyers. That is, and actually design changes. These are the type of criteria, I would say, that can help us to distinguish between the better and the worse, maybe. But yeah.
I would say then, in response to this very fair point, that I mean, thinking about the criteria is necessary, and when I think about this question, like the criteria, I usually refer to Haraway's early work on situated knowledges, and that's where the idea of power-sensitive conversations comes into play. So I think that would be my response always, like, it has to be power-sensitive, and whatever that means, informed by various types of critique that are focusing on studying these power dynamics that then affect how the design process is taking place, who gets to decide, and indeed which frameworks are adopted to determine whether a project is viable or ethical or desirable.
2 more questions. Mark.
Yeah, thanks for your talk. I saw in the talk that you mainly focus on non-human animals and environment as users. I wonder if the term stakeholder is not easier to also convince people that we should talk about them at all, because yeah, clearly non-human animals have a stake in some contexts. Also, the environment is quite an abstract term. So the environment of whom, for whom, and who or what exactly. But if we talk about that, then of course all these power questions come up also. For example, the humans and non-humans can have different interests, right? And there's power differences and so on. So yeah, for when it comes to the governance of technologies, then we really, I think, have to talk about that. And I wonder what you think about the term, using the term representation, because we as humans, we tend then, in the best case, to try to represent the interests of non-human nature, of non-human entities. Yeah, are we entitled to do that? What kind of power questions does that raise also?
Thank you so much. So maybe I'll start with the question of stakeholder versus user. And the reason why I refer to users is that I'm very much interested in affecting the way professional designers who are not trained in theory might react to some of these ideas. So that's why the experiment that I'm sort of conducting now with this, the environment as an unimaginable user persona is precisely trying to do this. So referring to a very standard method that designers use every day in their work, the creation of user personas that then they refer to every day to kind of imagine, the way their application or whatever it is that they're building will be used by different types of users. So if they're doing this ideation exercise anyway, I was just wondering what it might do to them and the way they relate to their own work when they are tasked with actually imagining something that is unimaginable because it's encompassing everything. And I don't think I can share results just yet because I had only one workshop, but in a year, hopefully I will be able to share something more concrete and see whether it actually helps designers map themselves onto the wider network of relations in a productive way or not. So that's why I refer to users, but of course, from a theoretical point of view, that's not the right term, and stakeholders would be more appropriate. And sorry, could you remind me of the second part?
Yeah, the second was a bit about power and representation, that right. Then we would represent the interests of the non-human.
So yeah, in a way, okay, I'll refer to this experiment again in a way because in some sense, the point of the exercise is not so much for humans to try to represent the interests of the environment, but rather to help them realize that they are part of the environment. So the question that this workshop starts with is like, close your eyes, okay, and then imagine the natural world. And what 99.9% of people that take part in these sorts of experiments come up with is like a beach or a forest, and there is never a human being in that picture. And so the point of this exercise is like to, first of all, question why isn't there a human in that picture when we try to imagine the natural world? And the second question is like, how do we place ourselves in that natural environment picture in our minds when we are starting to think about designing for the environment, which includes us.
It was great that you explored the imaginations.
Thank you so much.
So we'll close the questions with Pauline.
Hi, thank you very much for this meta-analysis. I found it really helpful and inspiring. Part of my question was already asked and answered, so thanks. The other question that I have is, do you have any examples where it actually was implemented in design, and does it really work? Do you know?
Do you mean these radical alternative toolkits?
Yeah, and then not in a museum, but actually in a real-life setting.
Yeah, that's a very good question, because I mean, quite obviously the answer is no. and when you show professional designers trained as designers, because you could argue that we are all designers, and I would agree with that. But professional designers, especially educated in the West, when you expose them to such tools, they're like, well, but what does it actually mean for me? Like, I don't know how to implement it. But this is why the idea of politics comes into play very importantly for me, which is to say that sometimes it might not be about changing the practice of design itself, but rather thinking of, so this is where some of the toolkits that I did not refer to explicitly, just mentioned them, the intersectional design toolkits, they're much more, so another ideation tool that I did not discuss, the pluriversal design ideation tool, is really about enabling people that are usually excluded from these debates to essentially get acquainted with the right vocabulary to then imagine their own ideas for certain technologies and participate in these conversations in a more effective way. I'm not sure if this, so I guess the answer to your question would be, I am not necessarily interested in the question of usability of these toolkits, but rather what they can do politically to allow for a change of mindset, perhaps in one group, and then also an empowerment of other groups. And also it's important to say that these toolkits, the other alternative toolkits, are produced by the groups themselves. So this is also not me sitting, in Cambridge and producing something that allows certain groups of people to participate more actively necessarily. Is just also drawing attention of the AI ethics community. That is, I don't think it's a strawman argument really. The attention of the community to the fact that there are these alternative positions and alternative toolkits and alternative ways of thinking about design. Alternative is also a problematic term, but I think you know what I mean.
Thank you so much, Tomasz.
Thank you.